All right, everyone. I'm Vince White. I'm an employment attorney, and I'm here with Eric Sarver, who is also an employment attorney. He's been on the channel before. As I recall, you all loved him. And if you remember, Eric is a compliance and defense attorney. However, I have to stress being a compliance attorney means he's one of the good guys, one of the good ones. He's keeping, generally speaking, employers from doing the bad things. And if you can avoid literal hate crime in the workplace, you've provided a service far more beneficial to the utility of the world than something that I would do, which essentially amounts to playing whack-a-mole with employers that I think are bad. He's kept a harm from occurring, which is better than punishing a harm. So super excited to have him on the channel. Eric, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it very much. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me back. I would say that you might not be giving yourself enough credit. I think in terms of the whack-a-mole description, I think that, the world needs plenty of people on the plaintiff side as well to make the companies motivated to call me up to hire me and my firm to say, hey, we've got to comply with these laws, right? Because if we don't, guys like Vincent White, other attorneys will step forward, write a demand letter, write a complaint on behalf of their clients. So, but just want to put that out there, for the universe, for yourself. But thank you. I'm doing well. It's been a good week so far. I can't believe it's Friday. I feel like the days are long, but the weeks are quick. I don't know if you find that as well.
I do. I do. So I
Hmm.
I went ahead and scheduled myself a live stream for later today, like a 2 hour
Oh,
live stream block. And
wow.
I don't know if I have enough in the tank. Like frankly, I'm so
Oh,
tired. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to. I'm gonna do it, but this week, these weeks go by like trucks and trains, just right over
yeah.
your back. It is what it
Here,
is.
here.
Um, I do. I always view what you do. I appreciate the kind words, but there's two things that's going to make the world a better place: storytelling, because I think human beings can like change how they feel and how they think in their hearts based on
Mhm.
stories of unfortunate events in the workplace. But I do think attorneys such as yourself who avoid the problems and can extinguish the unfortunate things before they happen, that's the other mechanism by which the world could actually be a better place. I agree.
Mhm.
I'm necessary, but I would hope that perhaps soon I may not be. We'll see.
That would be an ideal, right? We could find other things to do another time, maybe, or
I would
we can,
love
change our
like
focus. But I hear you. Yeah,
farming.
it's a nice thought.
I would be
Yeah.
farming full time.
Oh,
Now,
really?
Eric,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's my retirement plan.
Nice.
Um, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, have been pretty busy, and I know you've been keeping an eye on it. Do you want to
Yeah.
give us a little bit of the lay of the land here and what's going on?
Sure. Excellent. Well, I'll start with the one on people's minds, which is the later decision, the FTC, right? The
Yeah.
recent rule, that proposed banning non-compete agreements. And the NLRB weighed in on this issue about a little over a year ago. But kicking it off with the FTC. So if folks have been following lately over the last few weeks, the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, has issued a ruling, and they're federal, right? Federal ruling. So it's supposed to supposed to supersede any state laws that might contradict it. That basically says that non-compete agreements will be null and void going forward, starting September 4th, right? And so it applies to pretty much private companies, private employers. Interesting enough, it does not apply to nonprofits, right? Because of the way the FTC, right, is in charge of legislating over private industry and commerce. So it won't be affecting nonprofits, at least in terms of the FTC proposed ban. But basically, what it'll do is it will prevent employers from having the objective, concrete contract, the non-compete agreement, right? So it says you can't hinder, prevent, stop an employee, a worker. And this is all like in the post-termination world, right? Once they've stopped working for your company, you can't stop them from taking a competing job, like with the competition, or starting their own business that has the same exact services. They're trying to ban that basically, and it's carving out a few exceptions. It's saying if you're like a policymaker, well paid, so you're making like more than 151,000 and change a year in
Oh,
compensation. Yep. And if you're a policymaker, so you have to be someone that hires and fires, makes chief decisions around the company, that you can be subject to a limited non-compete, like reasonable in time frame and scope. It also the FTC rule is basically saying, hey, if you're part of a business and you're selling a business, let's say you have two business partners, you can tell the business partner, hey, listen, we'll buy back your share of the business, but we're going to hold you to a non-compete. And I think the policy considerations are that if you're a high-paid executive and a policymaker, you probably have all the limits, the secret sauce of the company that could destroy them with competitive secrets. And you're making enough money, you're making, 250K a year, to maybe withstand the non-compete. But that's basically the scope. And the reasons why the FTC ban is different than what we've been seeing in state-to-state laws is that well, first off, right, it goes a little further. It says that clawback provisions and things like that won't fly. So a lot of companies would get around, let's say, certain state law non-compete bans by saying, okay, well, you have certain severance or you have certain, let's say like executive compensation, and if you want that stock to vest or that severance, you have to follow this non-compete. If you don't, we're not going to enforce it. We just won't give you any severance or any benefits. Some states have weighted on that in different ways, but the FTC is basically weighing in to saying no, that if you're forcing an employee to leave money on the table, it's a form of being
Oh,
penalized, right? It's a punishment. So that's interesting. And then there's not to get too like crazy out there, then there's a question of like these ERISA governed plans, like these ERISA is a federal statute protects certain executive compensation, and that statute is not preempted, it's not FTC territory. So there's a lot of confusion about how it applies there. But I think the key takeaway is like for the average employee is if you've got an existing non-compete and there's no litigation started over it, if this rule passes, you're in luck, right? Good news, it they have to dissolve that non-compete. And if you have a non-compete, and let's say you leave the company, this rule goes into effect September 4th, you leave, let's say September 5th, or you leave before then, they can't enforce it, they can't claw back your severance. So that's some of the main teeth. And then there's one more thing I would say, and I'll pause, it's a lot to take in, right?
yeah.
Is that a lot of companies find end runs around laws, right? They try to put form over substance. So, one thing companies have done in the face of state-to-state non-competes is they've said, okay, we're going to just make your non-disclosure agreement so broad that everything's confidential and you can't talk about anything you've done here. And we'll make the non-solicit, right, so broad that you can't solicit a potential client of ours. And so therefore the person's like sort of de facto, they're, unofficially their hands are tied. They can't compete. So this new FTC law is going to say, hey, if an NDA, if a non-disclosure agreement is so broad that it has that effect, it might not be enforceable. And that's where we're at with the FTC rule.
That's incredible. And I think we might agree on this. Anyone who's for employee rights or frankly
Yeah.
pro economy
Mm.
is probably a fan of abolishing or at least reducing the impact of non-compete agreements. Is that
Mm-hmm.
safe to say? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we're on the
Yes.
same page there.
Yeah. Mm.
I don't mean to keep referencing the NLRB's action, but just to
Sure. It's a good.
use it to compare,
Mm.
one thing I noticed, and we don't talk politics on this channel at all, but
Okay. Sure.
both of these decisions, holdings,
Mm-hmm.
were at least influenced or originally pushed by Biden appointees.
Yes.
However, I've noticed, at least with the NLRB decision, that President Biden has not taken credit at all
Mm. Right.
or supported it in any way.
Mm.
So I have worries, or at least I had worries about the NLRB decision before this FTC holding, that it might just die on the vine for lack of a strong supporter, right?
Right.
Do you expect the FTC holding to survive litigation?
It's a great question. I think it's at a decent chance of surviving litigation. I
That's
mean, I
exciting.
do see I can see like a more than 50% chance though of that the court case will give it a run for its money, right? Because the FTC, from what I understand, some of the challenges like this Ryan LLC case, I think it's called versus FTC. My understanding is that like constitutionally speaking, the question is, does the FTC have the authority and the power to make this type of rule? Because the I think it's the Major Questions Act. Like if you have an issue of substantial political or economic significance, and this
Yeah.
clearly is that, right? then Congress has to specifically give you that rulemaking authority. So I think that's the argument being made that this is also beyond their scope of their power, right, to pass
Yeah.
legislation. So as I'm saying it out loud, maybe I'll put the chances of being overturned as a little higher than 50% because there's also the issue of like there's a case that's called Chevron. It's a case that went back like several decades, and it basically says that if there is a government agency that's filling in the blanks with a reasonable interpretation of what they think the law requires, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, that that the federal agencies will defer to that and let it stand. But the problem is if a private company challenges the rule, you still come back to the same constitutional question. Is this within their scope? This is not Congress, right? The FTC is not Congress. They can't pass a law. So I could see how that plus state laws, might, and then of course they have the people in pro-business who say, hey, this is an unfair restriction on commerce because they'll argue that they need non-competes, to protect trade secrets, and so there's a lot there, right? There's a lot to unpack.
There really is. So I had to speak to a reporter
Hmm.
about this the first time around for the NLRB.
Yes.
And it was fascinating because the reporter said, hey, can you, like, where did this field of law originate? And I
Hmm.
said, oh, I mean, that's not really how attorneys think, but I can find out for you. And I
Hmm.
did. And it turns out the
Right.
origination of NDAs and non-competes was largely naval shipping captains
Mm.
because maritime shipping companies would have specific routes through
Mm.
sandbars that could shave days off of shipping
Mm.
routes. And so
Mhm.
for a very, very long time, they could only let their family captain their ships. And it
Mm.
was the advent of these NDAs and these non-compete agreements, which they felt they could actually enforce, that they started to be able to hire people outside their family who they, maybe didn't have the same level of trust with to do the job. And that was incredible because it did generate some dispersion of wealth, right? There was some level of like, we don't have to be born to the shipping magnate family anymore to become a boat captain, a ship captain,
Oh,
right?
right.
Um, so it was really interesting how the area of law originally served employees and
Mm.
served the to lower the difference in wealth, like the haves and have nots, right? And then over
Right.
time, it seems like it's really been weaponized to do the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And I was so interested by that. I
Mm.
share your concerns about
Mm.
the litigation. I mean, my big thing is this
Yeah.
is invalidating an entire field of law, not
Mm.
a very
Mm.
significant portion of our field, right?
Yeah.
And it's
Right.
being done by unelected officials
Mm.
with a
Right.
stroke of a pen, with
Yeah.
almost no warning.
Mm.
How do we do business and I love this. Don't get me wrong. I love the whole
Yeah.
thing. But how do
Right.
we do business in a nation where you can believe that an area of law, a contractual term,
Mm.
is allowable and viable
Yes.
for, I mean,
Question.
110 years in
Right.
different formats. And then one
Right.
day someone gets appointed with a couple of
Right.
really amazing opinions
Mm.
and they say,
Mm.
no more.
Mm. Right.
There is
Mm.
something to be said there, right?
Sure, sure, because the stroke of the pen of the whim, of an agency could cut in the other direction, against workers' rights or to strike, workers' hopes and opportunities down as well. There's something to be said for that, right? The rule of law in terms of how much an agency has in terms of power, but also to your point, if whole industries have been set up and by design, to have non-competes in place, that might factor into like how much they offer for compensation, right? So
Yes.
you're getting paid very well. So, if they're afraid of people going to jump ship, now what's interesting there is that the argument would be, hey, if you're afraid someone will jump ship, isn't that more reason to treat them well and pay them well so they'll stick around? But, people can always say, well, true, but somebody will pay, has more money, they'll pay 50 grand more a year, and I want to go over there, so I'll take all these trade secrets with me. So it does raise interesting questions. Sometimes, we hear about an executive branch of government or order or something that a rule and we like what it says, but we don't like how it came about. And we know that can go in I know you don't mention politics, but we see how that goes in various ways. Somebody, sends out say a tweet on something, and all of a sudden an executive, order was passed. I'm thinking back a few years, but not to go there. But no, to honor the no politics code. But I think the NLRB decision, it's interesting too. You're right. Biden did not really step in and kind of own the fact that it was one of his, his appointees in the agency. So the NLRB decision focuses on workers' rights in terms of the right to unionize, the right to, to organize. And their concern is that if you have a non-compete, you're going to essentially chill their their speech rights under the National Labor Relations Act, right?
Yeah.
That if one of the weapons employees have is, oh, listen,
Thank you.
they can leave, they can organize a walkout, but if they know that once they're fired, if they're fired, they're bound by a non-compete and they can't find another job, will that silence them? That was the reasoning I think behind it. So in order,
Yeah.
but that's interesting too, because arguably the fear of losing a job and not being able to work somewhere, even without a non-compete, could be enough to chill, one's likely objections to certain labor practices. Does that mean we abolish employment at will? And it's a very interesting area. And I think, like
Mm.
you mentioned, the origins. We're talking about the theory and rationale behind it, and then there's that always important question that maybe our viewers out there are wondering: if you own a small business or you own a company or mid-sized business, what do you do? How do you draft? And if you're an employee and you're leaving a job where you had a non-compete, or you had no non-compete, but you had a very strict non-solicitation agreement, and what do I do, right? And how does this law impact my rights? What can I and can I not do under this FTC ban if it goes into effect? Like, it is being challenged, and I think an injunction of stay will probably be issued until the courts can figure this out.
Last question on this topic for me. Whenever we
Mhm.
see a hugely sweeping change like this,
Yes.
my mind always goes to the law of unintended consequences. And I
Mm.
always think
Yes.
of, the really horrific occupation of India by Britain. And they
Mm.
would have they had trouble with cobras. So they had a bounty on cobras. Like they wanted people to go out and
Mm.
kill cobras and bring them in so there'd be fewer
Mm.
cobras messing with their occupying forces.
Mm.
And so the
Mhm.
result, the unintended consequence was that people started breeding cobras to turn in for the
Right.
bounty. Clearly no one's going to that's it's not going to happen here, but
Mhm.
are we going to have a situation where there is less ability to move around, even though there's no non-compete? There'll be almost an effect of, hey, that person has worked at 3 companies. You can't hire that person. That person jumps. That person laterals, and
Mm.
you can't trust them. And
Mm.
I do
Right.
worry about the unintended
Mm.
consequences here.
Yeah.
And we moved so fast, which was so exciting, but
Hmm.
did we think it through? And I don't know the
Right.
answer.
I think that's a big question that comes up a lot in employment law, right? And I think that's a great point, Vince, because New York State and New York City, especially, but New York State's a very progressive state, and New York City more progressive. And
Sure.
they've passed a lot of legislation over the years. They've tried to pass, don't forget, New York State was passing at first a total and then a partial ban. They tried to pass this last year and this year. It didn't quite. It made it through the assembly, didn't go through because of challenges, and there were conflicting sides that wouldn't meet in the middle. So the governor did not pass it. At least
Yeah.
last time I checked, right? But in terms of this law of unintended consequences of well-meaning legislation, I feel like New York and New York City pass a lot of laws, or they try to. I think one of them was, to make that you can only fire for just cause. And then, companies will pick up and they'll move all the companies out to New Jersey or Connecticut or
Yeah.
maybe Texas, Ohio, especially nowadays, with everything being so remote in not every field, but most fields and
Yeah.
virtual, bless you. So the question
Thank you.
is,
Sorry.
that a law of saying, hey, you can't fire people without cause. A lot of employers are saying, well, what if we just have a bad personality clash? And now, as we're worried about litigation, I'm just not going to hire in New York State. So then you have all these New Yorkers that are out of work. So, well, they have to move their family and move, if they're not, let's say, a remote worker, move to another state. So I hear you about that with the non-competes, and it is a good question because companies that, like you said, that they see somebody moved around, and honestly, resumes, it's ironic, years ago, 25 years ago, if your resume, if you were like a job jumper, it was considered like a mark against you. I
Yeah.
can't stay in one place for now, from what I hear, because I'm a little older these days, a little more grays in the beard, is that, with a younger generation, Gen Z and young millennials, if you haven't moved around a lot, there's some skepticism. Why have you just been in one place? Aren't you
Yeah.
ambitious? So depending on who's hiring, yeah, that could totally be an issue where someone says, well, this person moved around a lot, and they might move around and take our trade secrets with them. We used to be able to protect that with a non-compete, now we can't. So on to the next candidate. Hmm.
I agree completely. Yeah, I believe Governor Hochul did refuse to sign the New York State. I believe it passed, but she refused to sign that New York State non-compete ban,
Right.
is my recollection. You mentioned, I had said it was my last question, but you brought up such a good point. Tell me if you know. I don't want to. I don't want to overstep. But you
That's
mentioned
okay.
that departure from at will employment that was toyed with. Um,
Yes.
I catch a lot of heat for because I'm a plaintiff side attorney, and this is not allowed. I believe
Hmm.
at will employment is amazing. I think it's important. And I
Yeah.
don't really believe, I think in a union setting, you can have employment that is not at will, right? There's a process, there's checks and balances there. But
Hmm.
in a random private employer, I don't, my mind does not grasp how it would work because of the
Hmm.
point you made. It could simply be a personality clash. Like you can just not like a human being and not have it be tied to a protected class. It could just, or they could just be bad at their job and you don't want to take the time to paper it. And I view a departure from at will employment to be horrific. And that is
Hmm.
not popular with my viewership. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, not that I'm trying to get you to go toe to toe with my
No, that's
viewership.
okay. No, sure. Well, I share your view, and it's funny because that's actually my view alongside yours is very popular with my viewership with employers,
I'm sure.
well, with businesses, right? But my views on non-competes depart from some of my
Yeah.
colleagues who are the defense employer side. They think this is right bad for business, and a business should be able to decide how to protect itself from unfair competition. And then the question is, well, what's unfair, what's fair? And should there be some regulations of, okay, if you're the lower level worker, you're not making a lot of money a year, you're maybe in the median or what have you, you're not exposed to the secret sauce, why do you need a non-compete to further tie you down? But if you're an executive and you make, $250,000 a year plus bonuses, and you have access to the secret sauce. So that's funny because that's how my colleagues look at it. So I'm unpopular in my views of being against non-competes. To your question though about the at-will employment, yeah, right, deviating from that. Again, I fear the two couple of things, right? One, I get a lot of clients, who letting people go because of this, not good at their job, and they didn't properly paper it, and they tried to put them in another position. They tried to teach them again, and it wasn't like some, like one egregious thing, right? They didn't come in and trash the place. They didn't go to a strip club on the company credit card, right? It was nothing egregious, but a lot of little things, and they would let the person go. And sometimes the person believes it's because of their protected class, right? It's because I'm Asian, it's because I'm Black, it's because I'm Jewish. And that gets tricky, right? Because sometimes it genuinely that is a factor and that should be dealt with and addressed. Other times it's truly not. And I used to do employee side back in the day, plaintiffs, work for a number of years, and I remember turning down some possible cases when either I just didn't see that connection. You happen to be of this trade. Um, so if employment and will were to be, yanked away, and there were private causes of action because people said I wasn't warned enough. My work was fine. Some work evaluation is very subjective, and how much can a small business, especially, be bothered to paper everything up so that if they have to let someone go, even after a few months, they can be sued for it. So yeah, I have an issue with departing. I think, and I think that would just lead a lot of employers to say, you know what, like we're not hiring in New York. We're going to open up our business in Connecticut, or maybe we'll go Pennsylvania,
Yeah, I mean that's a real
Hmm.
concern, especially now with New York experiencing a bit of a, I think they're calling it a doom spiral, right? They just,
Hmm.
what was it this week? They sold multiple office buildings for less than 70% of the remaining value of the loans in New York.
Yep, I heard something
Terrifying.
like that too.
I don't really understand.
Yeah.
I mean, I just did a new office lease in New York, and
Hmm.
they gave me on a 1 year office lease, they gave me a quarter of the year free.
Wow.
How is that sustainable for them? I mean, it's lovely for me,
Yeah.
but my goodness.
Right.
Um, okay. So I love everything. I, I just want to say on the way out of this topic, when you agree with
Yeah.
me on the non-compete, I knew you were a good guy. I didn't know you were that good of a guy. Like,
Oh, I'm gonna
because
say
there's very
thank
few
you.
defense attorneys who feel
I
that
like
way.
the stationery nugget. Mhm.
I mean, I'm just kidding around, but like that,
Yeah.
I agree completely.